In chapter 5 of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, he leaves Colonel Lloyd's plantation complex and departs to spend time with the Aulds. By this point in the narrative, you might be thinking, listening to the horrors that Douglass relates, the thought may have occurred to you as it occurred to me the first time I read it, and occurs to me again every time I reread it. The absolute miracle that a writer like Frederick Douglass was able to escape from slavery to become an activist in the abolition movement and to be given a platform to be able to write a text like this. One of the ideas that we haven't explored too much in this class, but I think is an important idea to reflect on, and it's particularly meaningful in the context of thinking about slave narratives, is the millions of voices that don't get heard. If you look back over all of the writers that we've read this term, and we've read a lot of people this term, but if you look back over the writers that we've read and you consider the fact that they had to get to work, they had to develop their skills, they had to finish their work, they had to find a publisher, the text had to be published, the text had to be kept around long enough, and then oftentimes had to be rediscovered in order for their work to be appreciated. I think about someone like Emily Dickinson, who did not live to see her poems recognized as masterpieces of 19th century American poetry. I think about Herman Melville, who didn't live long enough to see Moby Dick be rediscovered as a candidate for the great American novel. And when I read Frederick Douglass, I think about the fact that if anything had gone just slightly differently for Douglass, he may have never left slavery. He may have been enslaved for the rest of his life. He may have died as a young man. His voice might have been silenced and given, or never had any opportunity to express himself in writing. And when you read this, you think to yourself, or at least one of the thoughts that comes to me, is not necessarily what an astounding writer Douglass is, an astounding thinker Douglass is, although he is. But the thought that comes back to me is a haunting thought about the unknown number of potentially great writers who were caught within the institution of slavery, caught in bondage in the institution of slavery, and never had the opportunity to tell their own stories, never had the opportunity to put their pen to paper. It's hard to think that there could have been a greater writer than even Frederick Douglass, but we're talking about millions of people. And surely there was a greater writer than Frederick Douglass, who never found a way to write, who never found the opportunity to learn to read, to learn to write, and never left bondage in order to publish something for the purpose of writing. Douglass himself is aware of that. And in chapter 5, as he leaves the plantation to go to work with the Aulds, he reflects on the role that fate and providence play in his life. This is on page 1089 of the Norton Anthology of American Literature, Volume B, the 10th edition. I took upon my departure from Colonel Lloyd's plantation as one of the most interesting events of my life. It is possible and even quite probable that but for the mere circumstance of being removed from the plantation to Baltimore, I should have today, instead of being here seated by my own table. Right? Note the pronoun my own table. In the enjoyment of freedom and the happiness of home, writing this narrative, been confined in the galling chains of slavery. Going to live at Baltimore laid the foundation and opened the gateway to all my subsequent prosperity. I have ever regarded it as the first plain manifestation of that kind of providence which has ever since attended me and marked my life with so many favors. I regarded the selection of myself as being somewhat remarkable. There were a number of slave children that might have been sent from the plantation to Baltimore. These were those younger. There were those younger, those older, and those of the same age. I was chosen from among them all, and was the first, last, and only choice. I may be deemed superstitious and even egotistical in regarding this event as a special interposition of divine providence in my favor. But I should be false to the earliest sentiments of my soul if I suppressed the opinion. I prefer to be true to myself, even at the hazard of incurring the ridicule of others, rather than to be false and incur my own abhorrence. From my earliest recollection, I date the entertainment of a deep conviction that slavery would not always be able to hold me within its foul embrace. And in the darkest hours of my career in slavery, this living word of faith and spirit of hope departed not from me, but remained like ministering angels to cheer me through the gloom. This good spirit was from God, and to him I offer thanksgiving and praise. There's a certain extent in which Douglass's narrative is a fascinating intertext, a text that connects with another text, right? The word here, intertext. Douglass's narrative is an intertext with some of the Puritan writing and rhetoric. The idea of being a providentially chosen person, of not having the attitude of trying to suppress that thought, but perhaps embracing that thought, connects Douglass's text with Puritan texts and the idea of providence. But there's also a sense here, and it's kind of a Franklinian sense, right? In which Douglass recognizes too that he is a unique individual. That it is in part randomness and chance that allows Douglass to go through certain openings that are available to him and emerge on the other side with acquired knowledge that is going to serve him well in his life and his career as an abolitionist and civil rights advocate. But there's also a sense in that passage that I just read that Douglass recognizes that he has always recognized this voice in him that would have never been content to stay within the institution of slavery. And whether that voice is planted there by God, or whether that voice is personal to Douglass's character, whether that makes Douglass unique, or whether there are other individuals like Douglass who were simply unlucky and didn't have the same avenues open to them, is not entirely clear. But Douglass ends the passage by offering thanks and praise to God for having the power to endure even in the darkest of hours, and also the providence the fate, the luck, the randomness of it all that seemed to set him down a path. Chapter 6 is frequently anthologized as a text that reflects the importance of literacy and the importance of reading and writing. And I want to say here that as I read the passage related to chapter 6, that I'm going to not say the racial epithet that is inside the text. Instead, I'm going to leave a pause or a blank when I talk. And you know that the word itself is going to appear inside the pause and the blank as I talk. I don't think it's my place to say the word, and so I'm not going to say the word for the purposes of our discussion here, nor do I think I need to say the word in order for you to hear the word or to read the word as you are following along with me. Chapter 6 is what introduces us to the fortuitous experience of Mrs. Sophia Auld. Douglass goes to Baltimore to live and work with the Aulds, and while he's there, he first learns the beginnings of literacy, and this unlocks something within him. This is a crucial passage in the development of Douglass's life, and it's a crucial passage in his recognition of the power of language. Not just the power of language to tell stories, but as we know through linguistics and other studies, the power of language to convey abstract thought. Critical thinking relies on the development of language. And as Douglass begins to learn language, he develops a stronger sense of curiosity about his condition, and that leads him invariably to the conclusion that he always knew slavery was wrong, but he was not able to fully conceptualize in language and abstract critical thought why slavery was wrong. And that's what allows him to do that at the process of learning language. Now, note the interesting way that we meet Sophia Auld. Douglass describes her at first as never having had a slave under her control. So he is the first enslaved person that she has been able to control. And when he meets her at first, he notices the fact that she had never had oversight of an enslaved person, quote, preserved from the blighting and dehumanizing effects of slavery. I was utterly astonished at her goodness. I scarcely knew how to behave towards her. In time, though, we will see the way that she becomes corrupted by the institution of slavery. He says it will happen, and it does happen. Page 1090, Douglass tells us, very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on, and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. To use his own words further, he said, if you give an inch, he will take an L. A blank should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best blank in the world. Now, said he, if you teach that blank, speaking of myself, how to read, There would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what it had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. Skip a few sentences. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose, at whatever cost of trouble, to learn how to read. The very decided manner with which he spoke and strove to impress his wife with the evil consequences of giving me instruction served to convince me that he was deeply sensible of the truths he was uttering. Gave me the best assurance that I might rely with the utmost confidence on the results which he said would flow from teaching me to read. What he most dreaded, I most desired. What he most loved, I most hated. That which to him was a great evil, to be carefully shunned, was to me a great good, to be diligently sought. And the argument which he so warmly urged against my learning to read only served to inspire me with a desire and determination to learn. In learning to read, I owe almost as much to the bitter opposition of my master as to the kindly aid of my mistress. I acknowledge the benefit of both. So Douglass recognizes here that the fact that he is introduced to literacy drives him forward to want to learn more. But when he overhears the reasons that an enslaver has for denying literacy to the enslaved people he owns, it stimulates within Douglass a greater desire to learn. Because he recognizes that Mr. Auld is right. That knowledge does make people unwilling to accept the conditions that are put upon them, or less willing to accept the conditions that are put upon them. It opens the door to new insights. It expands the mind. It creates a possibility of what if. And not for nothing, but of course, one of the reasons why many enslaved people were kept from becoming literate was there was a deep worry that if individuals read the Bible, they would realize the Bible puts no condition on God's grace. And that the question might arise, are we not people deserving of God's grace? And if that's the case, the entire system of slavery becomes profoundly destabilized. The only thing that I think Douglass might quibble with Mr. Auld on is the idea that learning how to read would make him discontented and unhappy. Now, I think ultimately by the end of his life and by the publication of this manuscript, Douglass doesn't feel that way. But there are moments, and you'll remember them, there are moments for the rest of the narrative where Douglass seems to equate knowledge with a kind of curse. that knowledge itself is a kind of prison. When you know you could have it better and you don't. When you know how profoundly unfair it is and there's not much that you can do about it. When you know the system is corrupting. When you can see through and read through the lines of what people are writing and to know what actually is going on. For some people, that can be a source of power, but for others, they can devolve into cynicism. And Douglass does not devolve into cynicism in this narrative, although often he goes right up to the edge of giving up. He perseveres. The corrupting power is given a clarity of language in chapter 7. Douglass describes Mrs. Auld in the following way. Slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. When I went there, she was a pious, warm, and tender-hearted woman. There was no sorrow or suffering from which she had not a tear. She had bread for the hungry, clothes for the naked, and comfort for every mourner that came within her reach. Slavery soon proved its ability to divest her of these heavenly qualities. Under its influence, the tender heart became stone, and the lamb-like disposition gave way to one of tiger-like fierceness. Douglass shares the way that he learns to write and read. He uses boys that are approximately his age. Remember, he's still a boy at this time. He's not yet an adult. He meets boys on the streets of Baltimore or working in the docks as he's working. And he tells them that he can read better than they can. And of course, they accept his challenge, and in doing so, they are inadvertently teaching him how to read. Or he tells them that he can write words better than they can, and then they write the word to prove him wrong. And he's okay being proven wrong because in the process, he's learning how to write. He's getting the experience of writing at that time. On the top of page 1094, this is where the freedom seems everywhere around him, and he becomes increasingly aware of how knowledge at once frees the mind, but also traps the mind. As I read and contemplated the subject, behold, that very discontentment which Master Hugh had predicted would follow my learning to read had already come to torment and sting my soul to unutterable anguish. As I writhed under it, I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out. In moments of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I've often wished myself a beast. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own. Anything, no matter what, to get rid of thinking. It was this everlasting thinking of my condition that tormented me. There was no getting rid of it. He says, freedom appeared to disappear no more forever. It was heard in every sound, seen in everything. It was present to torment me with a sense of my wretched condition. I saw nothing without seeing it. I heard nothing without hearing it, and felt nothing without feeling it. It looked from every star. It smiled in every calm, breathed in every wind, and moved in every storm. The parallel structure here emphasizes the extent to which he feels it, and he feels it again, and he feels it again, and he feels it again. It's a sense in which he can't escape it. But it convinces him to continue. It convinces him to keep working. And that is what leads him to become determined to fight for his freedom and to escape. So in chapter 9, Douglass relates that he returns and back to the plantation, and that he has time in Baltimore first before he goes back to the plantation. Note the way that Douglass is engaging again in the level of cultural criticism that is profound within the text. On page 1100, he engages in a critique of the fact that those people who enslave but do so while being very religious are among the worst of the people who enslave. He says about a third of the way down the page, I indulged a faint hope that his conversion would lead him to emancipate his slaves, and that if he did not do this, it would at any rate make him more kind and humane. I was disappointed in both those respects. It neither made him to be humane to his slaves, nor to emancipate them. If it had any effect on his character, it made him more cruel and hateful in his ways, for I believe him to have been a much worse man after his conversion than before. Prior to his conversion, he relied upon his own depravity to shield and sustain him in his savage barbarity. But after his conversion, he found religious sanction and support for his slaveholding cruelty. He made the greatest pretensions to piety. So Douglass notes that in the process of becoming religious, he becomes worse as a person who is enslaving because he finds in the religion justifications for the way that he treats the enslaved people he owns. When Douglass comes back as a teenager, he's restless, and there's a decision to send him off to a man who has a reputation for being a slave breaker, someone who breaks the will of those who are enslaved and who are rebellious or resistant or defiant. And this is Mr. Covey. Mr. Covey is one of the great villains inside the text, and Mr. Covey is also a deeply religious man. So again, Douglass is pointing out the hypocrisies of Christianity at this point. Chapter 10, a long chapter in chapter 10, where he finally engages in the ability to stand up for himself and embraces a kind of liberty within his enslaved situation, where he's able to push back and claim space for himself and have a greater degree of freedom despite the fact that he is still enslaved. The pain and the abuse that Douglass experiences at Mr. Covey's hands nearly breaks him. In fact, at one point, Douglass, it says that he is broken. He's broken in body, soul, and spirit. But I think we know the fact that he endured and came out on the other side showed that he wasn't truly broken, or at least not broken all the way. Chapter 10 contains probably the most famous and poetic passage inside the narrative. And it's the moment that Douglass talks about seeing the sails on the boats in Chesapeake Bay and the way that he feels about the freedom of those sails on the bay. And I want to take a moment to read that passage together because I think it's so important. It starts at the bottom of page 1104. Our house stood within a few rods of the Chesapeake Bay, whose broad bosom was ever white with sails from every quarter of the habitable globe. Notice, I want you to pay attention as I read this, how very self-consciously literary this language is, right? Douglass is engaging in a kind of artificiality to express the highest hopes of his soul. Those beautiful vessels robed in purest white, so delightful to the eye of free men, were to me so many shrouded ghosts, to terrify and torment me with thoughts of my wretched condition. I have often in the deep stillness of a summer's Sabbath stood all alone upon the lofty banks of that noble bay, and traced with saddened heart and tearful eye the countless number of sails moving off to the mighty ocean. The sight of these always affected me powerfully. My thoughts would compel utterance, and there, with no audience but the Almighty, I would pour out my soul's complaint in my rude way with an apostrophe to the moving multitude of ships. The footnote here reminds you that an apostrophe is a rhetorical term where somebody addresses something that can't respond. You are loosed from your moorings and are free. I am fast in my chains and am a slave. You move merrily before the gentle gale, and I sadly before the bloody whip. You are freedom's soft-winged angels that fly round the world. I am confined in bands of iron. Oh, that I were free, that I were on one of your gallant decks, and under your protecting wing. Alas, betwixt me and you the turbid waters roll. Go on, go on. Oh, that I could also go. Could I but swim, if I could fly. Oh, why was I born a man, of whom to make a brute? The glad ship is gone, she hides in the dim distance, and I am left in the hottest hell of unending slavery. Oh, God, save me. God, deliver me. Let me be free. Is there any God? Why am I a slave? I will run away. I will not stand it. Get caught or get clear. I'll try it. I had as well die with ague as the fever. I have only one life to lose. I had as well be killed running as die standing. Only think of it. 100 miles straight north and I am free. Try it? Yes. God helping me, I will. It cannot be that I shall live and die a slave. I will take to the water. This very bay shall yet bear me into freedom. The steamboat steered in the northeast course from North Point. I will do the same. I will get to the head of the bay. I will turn my canoe adrift, and I will walk straight through Delaware into Pennsylvania. When I get there, I shall not be required to have a pass. I can travel without being disturbed. Let but the first opportunity offer, and come what will, I am off. Meanwhile, I will try to bear up under the yoke. I am not the only slave in the world. Why should I fret? I can bear as much as any of them. Besides, I am but a boy, and all boys are bound to someone. It may be that my misery and slavery will only increase my happiness when I get free. There is a better day coming. And this apostrophe, this speaking out to the ships on Chesapeake Bay and speaking out to God, is a revelation moment for Douglass. He commits himself more than ever to the idea of one day he will become free. And it is immediately after this event that he stands up to Mr. Covey. You have seen how a man was made a slave, Douglass says. Now you shall see how a slave was made a man. Douglass stands up and he gets into an impasse with Covey and they struggle back and forth. There's almost this Jacob fighting with the angel in the book of Genesis, kind of you're battling with God moment. It's a turning point, Douglass says. It rekindles the expiring embers that he had for freedom. It gave him a sense of manhood, being a man, both in the masculine sense and also in the human sense, is incredibly important for Douglass. He triumphs. Mr. Covey backs down. And from that day forward, Mr. Covey does not whip Douglass again. Douglass relates over the course of the rest of the narrative how he came to use his skills of literacy to lead a Sabbath school, to lead fellow enslaved people in learning the Bible, and having a sense of religiosity, of being a teacher. And he finds in that moment of being a teacher and revealing the Bible and reading and sharing and answering questions that he has a higher calling, that he wants not only to free himself, but he wants to help free all of those around him. He has a commitment then to the people around him. The narrative recounts an escape attempt that goes awry. Somebody finds out what's going on. Douglass and others become they're caught and they're put in jail and they're separated from each other. They manage to make it through, but Douglass eventually is able to escape by himself, not with a group of people as he planned, but by himself. At the start of chapter 11 on page 1121, Douglass refuses to tell us how he escapes from slavery. He'll later explain in other writings after the Civil War how he managed to escape. He took a uniform and passed himself off as an officer on leave, and he was able to escape on a train bound for the north with papers. But he refuses to identify the hows because he has this philosophical belief that people who work on the Underground Railroad or enslaved men and women who manage to escape should not be feeding into the public domain information about how they escaped. Douglass thinks this makes escaping from slavery harder for other people. And so he withholds his information, thinking that perhaps the way that he did it could be of use to somebody else and help people get out of slavery. So he's got this really interesting moment where he really pushes back rhetorically. He pushes back on the idea that the practitioners of the Underground Railroad would be enhancing the knowledge of people who are enslaving and the people who are legislating around slavery. It's a wonderful inversion of power for Douglass at the end of the narrative. At the top of page 1122, he says, "I would keep the merciless slaveholder profoundly ignorant of the means of flight adopted by the slave. I would leave him to imagine himself surrounded by myriads of invisible tormentors, ever ready to snatch from his infernal grasp his trembling prey. Let him be left to feel his way in the dark. Let darkness commensurate with his crime hover over him. Let him feel at every step he takes in pursuit of the flying bondman. He is running the frightful risk of having his hot brains dashed out by an invisible agency. Let us render the tyrant no aid." It's an inversion here where Douglass now has the knowledge and the power. It's no longer information that's been withheld from him, But now he has the information that is actually making it harder for the system of slavery to operate. And he wants to withhold that information from the people who run the institution of slavery at the level of the plantation complexes and also at the level of the United States Congress. Keep them in the dark, because Douglass recognizes that knowledge is power. And he refuses to cede the power of liberating people from slavery to those who are trying to stop that. He finds his way north, and he gets to start working. He reflects on the feelings here at the end of the text, on how he felt once he realized that he was free. But he also recognizes the plight that he has as someone who has escaped from slavery, and the risk that's still upon him that he may be caught and returned to bondage in the South. But he is able to engage in the acts of becoming the legal recognitions of becoming a person. And these are important to him, and he shares them. I think it's one of the most powerful aspects of the entire narrative, that it ends with reprinting of his marriage certificate, recognizing that he and the woman he's fallen in love with have a relationship that's worthy of recognition by the government. And of course, it's very powerful that it ends with the process by which he has his name identified. At the bottom of page 1126, here's what Douglass says. On the morning after our arrival at New Bedford, while at the breakfast table, the question arose as to what name I should be called by. The name given to me by my mother was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. I, however, had dispensed with the two middle names long before I left Maryland, so that I was generally known by the name Frederick Bailey. I started from Baltimore bearing the name of Stanley. When I got to New York, I again changed my name to Frederick Johnson and thought that would be the last change. But when I got to New Bedford, I found it necessary again to change my name. The reason of this necessity was that there were so many Johnsons in New Bedford. It was already quite difficult to distinguish between them. I gave Mr. Johnson the privilege of choosing me a name, but told him he must not take from me the name of Frederick. Right? We had looked at William Wells Brown's narrative, which is published about 8 years after Douglass's narrative. So that narrative is kind of following in the genre-defining moments that Douglass is writing. He must not take from me the name Frederick. I must hold on to that, Douglass says, to preserve a sense of my identity. Mr. Johnson had been reading The Lady of the Lake, and at once suggested that my name be Douglass. From that time until now, I have been called Frederick Douglass. And as I am more widely known by that name than either of the others, I shall continue to use it as my own. That sense of the last name is a variable, but that the first part of is his name, Frederick. That's who he is. It's his sense of identity. And the narrative largely ends with that memorable moment of Douglass acquiring an identity. An identity that reflects his new position in society as a man who is free, as a man who has escaped from slavery. Douglass tells us at the bottom of page 1128 at the end of his narrative, I was now my own master. It was a happy moment, the rapture of which can be understood only by those who have been slaves. It was the first work, the reward of which was to be entirely my own. There was no Master Hugh standing ready. The moment I earned the money to rob me of it. I worked that day with a pleasure I had never before experienced. I was at work for myself and newly married wife. It was to me the starting point of a new existence. When I got through with that job, I went in pursuit of a job of caulking. But such was the strength of prejudice against color among the white caulkers that they refused to work with me, and of course I could get no employment. So then he talks about how then he becomes involved in the anti-slavery movement, and that is what brings him to the production of this narrative. It's an astounding moment of self-discovery, of freedom, of liberation, of empowerment. And he gives voice to himself and owns his own narrative by writing his own narrative. It's an important and influential ending point in Douglass's life and his journey. And it affirms the importance of that it's not just enough to be a person. You have to be a person with a sense of humanity. And those around you have to treat you as if you are a member of a collective humanity. There's a respect that comes with being able to be yourself. There's a respect that comes with finding your own way. There's a respect that comes with freedom and autonomy and agency. Douglass says that's a level of freedom and happiness that no one can ever know unless they've been enslaved. And so many readers of his narrative would have not been enslaved, so they can't know it. But the power of the narrative, I think, is that Douglass puts to work rhetoric and language to create a masterful work of literature that puts us both in the moments that are so horrible. Douglass says no language can seem to capture it, though his language seems to come awfully close to capturing how horrible it is. No language can ever actually capture it. It can only ever be conceived of in your mind. And probably the worst thing you can imagine in your mind is still short of how terrible it actually was. But beautifully, Douglass ends the narrative with the reminder that escaping from that produces such a degree of happiness that language itself can capture that either. And that unless you've been through it, you'll never know the horrors. But unless you've been through it, you'll never know how the joys that come with it. It's a joy that nobody can know unless they've gone through it, but it's a recognition as well by the end of how few people would ever wish that they went through it. All in all, then, Douglass circles around and reaffirms the central thesis that the people who are enslaved are people, that slavery itself is a dehumanizing and corrupting institution that robs those people of their humanity, but in the process also robs the people who are enslaving of their humanity and robs the culture itself of its humanity. The only path forward, then, is the abolition of slavery. That is the logical, powerful, inevitable conclusion of Douglass's narrative. It's a meaningful work, and if you had the opportunity to read it in this class, or if you've ever had the opportunity to read it on your own, I hope you have the opportunity again one day to reread the narrative. It's often a difficult text to read because it can be so visceral, and if your empathy, like mine, is frequently attuned to the works that you read and you find yourself connecting with characters so deeply, it can be a text that can be difficult to want to get back into because the cruelty and the sadness and the savagery of the institution of slavery. But Douglass is a masterful writer, And as that moment of seeing the sails on Chesapeake Bay goes to show, he's capable of raising his language to a level of beauty and hope that is just as inspiring as his language can present the horrors and evils of slavery. Our course will continue with an exploration of anti-slavery rhetoric and anti-slavery literature before we close with an analysis of poems from the U.S. Civil War.